Welcome back to the Situation Room, otherwise known as your weekly dose of, oh my god, the world is fucked. I'm Simon Whistler, and this week we're bouncing between 4 different continents, each of which is screwed in its own special way. Starting in North America, we'll see how the White House's rhetoric about annexing Greenland is bleeding over into espionage and dangerous real-world consequences. Then we pivot over to Europe and a Franco-German plan to get serious on defense. From there is a jump to North Africa, where violence is once again engulfing Libya. Before we end, we'll take a trip to South America, where the regime of Nicolas Maduro is engaging in what appears to be destabilizing grey zone tactics against neighboring Guyana. As always, timestamps below if you want to just jump to a specific story, but obviously I'd rather if you watch the whole thing, because that's how YouTube works. Oh, and subscribe, why not? Let's get straight into our main story today, Greenland. It was one of the most disturbing scoops of the year. On May the 6th, the Wall Street Journal dropped the following bombshell, quoting, "The US is stepping up its intelligence gathering efforts regarding Greenland, drawing America's spying apparatus into President Trump's campaign to take over the island." Quoting anonymous sources working in America's spy agencies, the story painted a picture of focus being redirected towards an ostensible ally. According to the journal's reporting, a, quote, collection emphasis message was recently issued to the CIA, the Defense Intelligence Agency, and the National Security Agency, ordering them to learn more about Greenland's independence movement. As the story notes, quoting again, a collection emphasis message helps set intelligence agency priorities, directing resources and attention to high-interest targets. It's that last phrase, high-interest targets, which may help explain why this story was so shocking. In the general course of things, US intelligence gathering might track the movements of Russian troops in Ukraine, say, or the dealings of domestic terrorists. So for it to target an ally like Greenland was all sorts of unusual. As the semi-autonomous territory's foreign minister, Vivian Motzfeldt, declared after the story broke, quote, "We're supposed to be friends. We are allies. Allies don't do such things." Now, before this segment really gets underway, we should be clear about the alleged extent of American intelligence gathering. As far as anyone could tell, it has so far been limited to open source intel rather than anything truly outrageous like wiretaps or infiltrating Greenlandic groups. Nor is anyone claiming that this is the first stage in a plot to do something drastic like overthrow the local government. Still, the revelation has combined with recent White House rhetoric to create a climate of anxiety. After all, it wasn't so long ago that Trump responded to NBC asking if it'd rule out taking the island by force by saying, "I don't rule it out, I don't say I'm going to do it, but I don't rule out anything." And it's here that we get to the intriguing part. Whether or not Trump really wants to invade Greenland, the perception of this threat is already scrambling politics in multiple places. And that's leading to all sorts of unpredictable consequences. Nowhere has this been clearer than in Denmark, a nation that until recently considered itself one of America's staunchest allies. As its politicians like to point out, Danish troops fought alongside the US in Iraq and Afghanistan, where they sustained dozens of casualties. The reason we're discussing the Danes is because Greenland's current legal status is as a semi-autonomous part of the Kingdom of Denmark. Although most affairs are devolved to the island and its 56,000 residents, Copenhagen maintains control over defense and foreign policy while also providing annual subsidies to the tune of $550 million, roughly equivalent to 20% of Greenland's GDP. And we say current legal status because the fate of Greenland could change at any time. Since 2009, the island has had the right to become a fully independent state should the population vote in a referendum to go it alone. Given the history between Copenhagen and Nuuk, that seems all too likely. Long administered as a colony, the island suffered terribly under Danish rule. In the 1960s, for example, some 4,500 Inuit women were forcibly fitted with contraceptive coils to stop them reproducing. Former Greenlandic Prime Minister Mute Egede described this as a genocide. This and other grim legacies have left Greenlanders with a strong independent streak. Post-2009 polls have consistently shown vast majorities in favour of splitting off from Denmark. Yet it's here that we come to the first unintended consequence of Trump's Greenland fixation. Recent actions, like the intelligence gathering leak, may be pushing Nuuk closer to Copenhagen. That's the conclusion some have drawn from Greenlandic elections in March, which saw the opposition Democrats come to power on a platform of a slow path to independence. Now, the Democrats' desire to approach secession gradually is rooted in basic finances. A Greenland that stands on its own 2 feet is one that will need to replace the giant subsidy Copenhagen sends with economic growth. And while plans are underway to expand the tourism and mining sectors, Nuuk is still a long way from good financial health. But with the threat of annexation hanging over them, the party and the coalition it leads seems to have pivoted in a more pro-Danish direction. Since the election, new Prime Minister Jens Frederik Nielsen has made a point of travelling to Denmark, doing presses with the Danish Prime Minister, and even travelling back to Greenland with the Danish King in tow. If that wasn't enough, the PM also declared, President Trump says that the United States is getting Greenland. Let me be clear, the United States is not getting it. We do not belong to anyone else. We determine our own future. Of course, it's not like Nuuk or Copenhagen could do much to stop the US if it carried out a military invasion. But the assumption for now is that we're still living in a world of rules, one in which allies don't attack one another. And that means Nuuk's growing closeness to its former colonial ruler could negatively impact the White House's strategic goals. One extreme example of this is the new American-Danish defense agreement that would allow US troops access to Danish bases. Agreed in 2023, it's now due to be voted on next month in Denmark's parliament, a move that has become a source of anxiety for some politicians who worry it gives a belligerent Washington too much power. Now, to be clear, the likelihood of the bill being voted down is pretty low, but even the fact that it's being discussed shows how Trump's demands are shifting the geopolitical landscape. Another area where these shifts are visible regards mining. Greenland is home to a crazy amount of rare earth minerals, from uranium to graphite, including, as Politico notes, quote, 40 of the 50 critical minerals that the US deems vital to its national security. Not only that, but the US Geological Survey claims as many as 17.5 billion barrels of oil and vast fields of natural gas may exist off the Greenlandic coast. As a result, many assume the White House's desire to secure the island is really about securing access to resources. But if that's the case, the current strategy may be counterproductive. American firms can already apply for exploration licenses on the island, but Nuuk may be starting to favor rivals. Speaking to Politico, Foreign Minister Vivian Marsveld suggested that the European Union might instead get the chance to extract Greenland's minerals, building on a 2023 memorandum that aimed to, quote, develop sustainable raw material value chains between Brussels and Nuuk. Given that Greenland withdrew from the precursor to the EU in 1985, that's a pretty big claim. But Marsveld was pretty direct about it, telling the outlet, quoting again, of course, we want to have cooperation with our critical minerals with our like-minded countries, and the EU is a good partner. We like them. Now, such agreements may come to nothing. The Financial Times recently looked into the economics of large-scale extraction in Greenland and concluded that weather and poor infrastructure meant, quote, access to many mining areas remains tricky. But it's certainly a diplomatic shot across Washington's bow, an attempt to show that Nuuk has options. Nor is Europe the only place showing an interest. For one American adversary, worries about the annexation of Greenland present the perfect wedge issue. Yes, and yes, it's the part of the video where we talk about China. As the Jamestown Foundation has noted, Beijing has seen the recent cooling of relations between Washington and Brussels as its best ever chance to drive a wedge between America and Europe. Foreign Ministry spokesman Lin Jian recently tweeted that, quote, China fully respects Denmark's sovereignty and territorial integrity on the Greenland issue and hopes that Denmark will continue to support China's legitimate position on issues related to its own sovereignty and territorial integrity. To which Chairman of the Danish Parliament Defense Committee, Rasmus Jarlov, angrily replied, quote, why does the USA allow China to look like a better ally to Denmark than they are? Again, no one really thinks that Copenhagen is going to respond to Trump's fixation with Greenland by leaping into bed with the CCP. Not even Lin Jian really believes that. Rather, the problem is that the administration is handing Beijing yet another issue where it can work to push old allies apart. This despite the White House's stated goal of acquiring Greenland in the interests of national security. Back in March, Trump gave an address to Congress where he claims that, quote, we need Greenland for national security and even international security, and we're working with everybody involved to try and get it. While he didn't spell out exactly what this meant, there are some obvious answers. One is that the Arctic is warming up and the retreating sea ice will give China and Russia access to important new shipping routes that can be controlled by whoever holds Greenland. Another is that Greenland would be vital to US homeland defense in case of a Third World War. As the Center for Strategic and International Studies points out, not only are the waters between Greenland and Iceland the gateway to the Atlantic for Russia's Northern Fleet, but, quote, the shortest route for a Russian ballistic missile to reach the continental United States would be via Greenland and the North Pole. The odd thing is, the US already has the tools and the access to neutralize these threats. During the 2010s, Beijing repeatedly tried to invest in maritime and airport infrastructure in Greenland, only for a US pressure campaign on Nuuk to kill the deals. As for defending against military threats, a 1951 agreement still in force allows the US to build bases and deploy troops to Greenland as it sees fit, so long as Danish sovereignty isn't compromised. In practice, that means Washington could theoretically develop a lot of military infrastructure on the island. As Denmark's foreign minister Lars Løkke Rasmussen has noted, quote, "In 1945, the United States had 17 bases and military installations in Greenland with thousands of soldiers. Today, only one American base is left." Now, that one remaining installation is Pituffik Space Base, and while you could see it as a wonderful example of American, Danish, and Greenlandic cooperation, you could also see it as evidence that both Washington and Copenhagen have dropped the ball on military investments on the island. The Danish position is that they and the Greenlandic Parliament have requested the US increase its military footprint for years now, only to be rebuffed. The American position is that the Danes have been coasting and need to do more to fortify the island against Arctic threats, something Copenhagen tacitly admitted to when it recently unveiled a $2 billion defense package for Greenland. If we're talking about consequences, then this could be seen as a positive one. If we assume that Trump's talk of annexing Greenland is all bluster, a ploy to make Denmark get serious about Arctic defense, then this would be proof that that strategy is working. Indeed, Foreign Minister Vivian Motzfeldt has been open about wanting to cooperate more with the United States on defense, even as her government aims to develop mining deals with Europe. Sadly, we can't say for sure that this really is bluster. Not given the intelligence collection efforts, not given the repeated remarks about the US getting the island, and even if it is a bluff, it's worth pointing out that even bluffing can cause others to react in unpredictable ways. As we've already outlined, Trump's strategy at the moment seems to be pushing Greenland away from America, even as it creates small openings for adversaries like China. The spying revelations, likewise, are damaging relations with Nuuk at a time when Greenland's resources are becoming ever more important. The oddest part, it all seems just so unnecessary. As the CSIS writes, quote, "By leaving the question of Greenland sovereignty aside and continuing its current engagement strategy, the United States can reap significant benefits while passing the hefty bill of running the island onto Denmark. In other words, the status quo allows the United States to have its cake and eat it too." Now, the consequences of Trump's threats to annex Greenland may be relatively minor for now, but they could soon snowball into a much bigger crisis, one that, more than anything else, could imperil the very outcomes the White House claims that it's trying to achieve. Just before we continue, quick plug for our fantastic newsletter. Look, imagine never missing the critical details behind today's global events, those decisive moments and hidden narratives that shape our world. And that's exactly what you'll get with the WarFronts newsletter. Every week, you'll receive expertly curated insights into global conflicts, powerful military strategies, and analysis delivered directly to your inbox. No fluff, no noise, just crystal clear clarity wrapped in compelling stories and fascinating historical connections that you just won't find anywhere else. It's completely free, it's genuinely valuable, and signing up just takes a few seconds. There's a link below. Understanding the world just got a whole lot easier thanks to our newsletter. And now back to it. Next up, we turn our attention to affairs on the European continent, where the process of rearmament and reinvigoration of European defense just received a much-needed shot in the arm. In early May, the continent's two biggest defense spenders formed an agreement, not to buy some new weapon system or hold joint military exercises, but to create a Security Council for Europeans, by Europeans, to lead Europeans. The two nations in question are, of course, France and Germany, who combined spend the equivalent of about $146 billion on defense. That's from the year 2024. During a trip to Paris, on his first state visit since becoming Germany's new chancellor, Friedrich Merz met with French President Emmanuel Macron to discuss a wide range of continental matters. But it was a matter of defense that was at the top of both leaders' minds. Speaking to global press following their meeting, Macron pledged that Germany and France would combine their efforts to create a system for joint strategic leadership. Quoting here, "Beyond tanks, combat aircraft and long-range missiles, we will establish a Franco-German Defense and Security Council that will meet regularly to provide operational solutions to our common strategic challenges." End quote. The reason to create the Security Council was precisely the one that you would expect. It was, quote, "the systemic threat Russia poses to our European system," end quote. Merz gave his own strong endorsement of the deal, issuing a call simultaneously to the other member states of the European Union to increase their defense spending, while calling upon the United States, in turn, to remain militarily and politically engaged on the continent. Now, anytime a new geopolitical body is consecrated around the world, and especially in the European Union, where our sources inform us that the current rule is that they've got to create 3 new international organizations and are created every time Ursula von der Leyen sneezes, it's worth asking whether the announcement really means anything at all. At best, a whole lot of these agreements just turn out to be diplomatic showpieces, and at worst, some of them turn out to be just hot air. But although it's not yet certain that Germany and France will make good on their agreement, a jointly run Security Council between the two nations could begin to address multiple problems at once, while opening the door to other continental defense initiatives that may ultimately be even more important. To understand those problems, we've got to zero in on the two men involved and their respective governments. Macron and Merz are leaders with a whole lot in common, including a shared vision for a remilitarizing Europe. Both have advocated for rapid increases to defense spending across the continent, large-scale procurement initiatives to refill Europe's arsenal, and a focus on European autonomy, ensuring that the continent can stand on its own 2 feet without America's involvement. Speaking of the US, both governments have watched the new administration in Washington with some trepidation, seeing an America that's become increasingly unreliable on defense and trade, especially where Europe is concerned. Both the French and German governments are believers in building a closer financial and political relationship, while viewing themselves, on defense matters, as a European vanguard that should be able to fight side by side. Not only that, but both leaders are eager to bring Germany out of the mud after a drawn-out and painful few years under Olaf Scholz that lacked the vision or the ambition that this new German leadership wants to bring. In short, both Merz and Macron are of the opinion that it's long past time for Europe to get off its arse and take care of its own business. And it's telling that when Merz took his first official trip to any other nation, it was a trip to visit Macron, where this joint Security Council agreement was the primary achievement for both sides. As for what a Security Council could actually accomplish, the best place to start is with the United States, where the unreliability and disengagement that Merz and Macron are afraid of is of paramount importance. The nations of the European Union, or with a few modifications, the non-US nations of the NATO alliance, don't need the United States for everything. The rest of NATO has decent manpower, decent amounts of sophisticated warfighting equipment, and a shared goal of reinvigorating the continent's defense industrial base. But they rely heaviest on the United States, with no real plan to improve the situation, in 3 key areas: strategic leadership, logistical coordination, and the nuclear umbrella. On matters of grand strategy, the US has traditionally led and staffed NATO's strategic commands, built its strategic approach to geopolitical challenges, and led the other nations of the alliance in peacetime, with the assumption that US direction would be even more important in a time of war. On logistics, America's ability to both transport troops and hardware and manage vast supply and reinforcement operations across the globe are unmatched. Finally, on nuclear matters, it's American warheads that are forward deployed to Germany, Italy, and other NATO member states. And while there are no precise promises to this effect, at least not yet, a joint strategic command formed by Germany and France would have the potential to address all 3 of those problems at once. On strategic leadership, the A to B logic is rather obvious. A Franco-German Security Council could provide supplemental or fallback strategic leadership, either to supplement the US or to compensate if Washington were to suddenly pull out of its commitments, and with time, it could even start to take over the duties Washington has made clear it doesn't want. On logistics, while European strategic leadership is just one part of what's needed, a dedicated Security Council to jointly manage affairs could become a valuable asset in coordinating acquisitions of aircraft and ships and creating plans to govern their future use. And on nuclear matters, France is already exploring the prospect of extending its own nuclear umbrella to cover European nations, something that Merz has expressed interest in facilitating for Germany's benefit. It's important to note here that both Merz and Macron emphasized repeatedly the importance of continued American engagement in Europe. Both leaders made it clear, in as many words, that even as Europe takes steps to organize and strengthen itself, America's military role on the continent is irreplaceable. On nuclear matters, both men emphasized that an extension of France's nuclear umbrella into other nations could only come as a complement to American security guarantees rather than replacing them. Certainly, it's to France and Germany's benefit to make clear to Washington, and particularly the Trump administration, that a new Franco-German leadership structure isn't just an opportunity for America to throw up its deuces and leave. But we've also got to acknowledge the side of this equation that neither Merz nor Macron nor their governments have publicly touched on. If the United States does decide to abandon its European commitments or scale them down dramatically without a plan to fill the gap, then this new Security Council will be the best contingency option that the European Union has. Okay, moving back to the United States, a joint Security Council could be a massive help in the effort to rearm Europe. The continent is currently suffering from a few problems at once in that regard. Sluggish spending, conflicting priorities, lots of redundancy in equipment as each nation tries to build its own functioning military, and a shortage of the actual production contracts that would allow Europe's defense industrial complex to get moving. These are areas where Germany and France are struggling too. And we've published a couple of recent prior episodes that go into detail about just how much work they're going to have to do. But the fact that Germany and France have to dig themselves out of the mud doesn't prohibit them from helping other nations dig out at the same time. A joint defense organization between the continent's two biggest spenders and natural leaders could go a very long way in doing exactly that. Over the last couple of months, the EU has finally started putting real plans together on rearmament. A new continental defence plan, put forward by the EU itself, will make 150 billion euros available to invest in joint procurement projects coordinated between at least two EU nations at a time in order to build a credible military deterrent against Russia by 2030. The continent is working to simplify its rules on defence procurement, ease transfers of equipment between the continent's many nations, and round out neglected areas like logistical and space-based capabilities, air and missile defence, artillery, drones, and more. On the one hand, a Franco-German Security Council could quickly become a means to access a very large share of that funding and put it to joint use. On the other, a single leadership body providing a single strategic vision would be more able to coordinate spending among other European nations. That'll help them to prioritize the initiatives that really matter, avoid redundancy wherever possible, and understand where new acquisitions will fit into a broader continental defense. As the EU and the nations of the continent find more ways to dredge up money and add it to the pile, a leading Security Council can ensure that waste is minimized and efficiency is maximized. Merz and Macron also called for, quoting Macron here, a Franco-German defense innovation program enabling the development and procurement of advanced technologies that Europe has the technical expertise to design, but has lacked the resources and coordination to actually build at scale. That initiative may end up merging with another EU effort referred to as Rearm Europe that will mobilize another 800 billion euros for defense matters after a much-anticipated NATO summit this June. And then there is Ukraine, where France is spearheading an effort to deploy troops to Ukraine in the event of a ceasefire and ensure that the nation can serve as a bulwark against future Russian aggression. While that coalition of the willing effort is led by France and its non-EU partner, the United Kingdom, it'll predominantly involve troops and capabilities provided by EU nations, meaning that it'll be particularly important for nations like Germany to be a part of the initiative. A joint body run by France and Germany could account directly for the EU's biggest financial contributors toward the coalition, while at the same time providing smaller or less resourced European nations with a pair of trusted advocates, coordinating a Ukraine deployment where smaller nations will struggle to be effective leaders. And finally, the creation of a joint German and French Security Council could end up paving the way to other, larger international defense bodies that don't rely on the US. The defense relationship between France and Germany has a long continental history, and this new Security Council is really more of a reinvigoration of something that's atrophied than it is really a new initiative. But it also creates the very thing the EU needs most of all to stiffen its spine: precedent. Silly as it may seem, it is a hell of a lot easier to convince Europe's overlapping bureaucracies to think outside the box if somebody else started thinking outside the box first. And if Germany and France can prove that they really can create an effective, strategically relevant Security Council without America's help, then it's only a matter of time before other European nations warm up to similar ideas. What could a Council for European Defence really look like? Well, perhaps the EU's other biggest defence spenders could combine forces to create, say, a 6-seat strategic authority bringing together France, Germany, Italy, Spain, Poland and the Netherlands, who, by the way, combined to spend the equivalent of over $250 billion last year alone. Or a council could bring in powerful non-EU nations like Turkey and the UK, or even important allies outside the continent like Japan, Canada or South Korea. Those would be unconventional steps, to be sure, but among the most valuable lessons that the EU could possibly internalize right now is that Europe is well within its rights to act unconventionally or to chart its own course. If the continent is going to recognize that its strategic vision won't reliably come from America, then the next step is for Europe to figure out what path it would chart for itself if it didn't have to simply replicate what Uncle Sam would have wanted. And lest anybody be concerned that this would simply be another bureaucratic non-answer to Europe's problems, well, it certainly could, but it doesn't have to be. It's not lost on continental leaders, especially Macron and Merz, that Europe's love of red tape and deliberation has come with profoundly negative impacts on defense. But more important than recognizing a problem is fixing it. And that's where the importance of precedent really comes into play. If this new Joint Security Council can show a new path forward for Europe, not just cutting through, but showing results along with it, then the example set by the EU's two defense leaders might actually be able to motivate the rest of the continent to act. Right now, Europe doesn't lack recognition of its problems, and it doesn't lack the continental will to start taking meaningful action. It lacks momentum, it lacks continental leadership, and most of all, it lacks a plan. Make no mistake, this initiative between Merz and Macron could turn out to simply be more hot air, but it's got real potential. And if that potential can be realized, then it may go down in history as the start of a desperately needed reinvigoration. So, from Europe we turn to Northern Africa, where the Libyan capital city of Tripoli has been rocked by its worst violence in years. The fighting has left an indeterminate number of people dead, and it's marked what may be a seismic shift in Libya's internal power dynamics. Yet it all traces back to the life and the death of one man known across the city of Tripoli as Genua. Born in the city of Benghazi as Abdul Ghani al-Kikli, Genua rose to prominence in Tripoli over the last several years as the man at the helm of a paramilitary organization known as the Stability Support Apparatus, or SSA. Active since the start of Libya's second civil war and organized under Genua's command since day one, the SSA has been powerful in and around Tripoli ever since. It adopted its current name in 2021. It's got outposts in other towns outside Tripoli, and in recent years, it's been tasked with tamping down on illegal migration and smuggling networks that run through the city. During its decade and more in operation, the SSA has become part of the larger power struggles between militias and paramilitary organizations across Tripoli. For the past several years, Tripoli has been splintered into zones of control where, in each zone, an individual armed group will be in charge and can typically do as it pleases. Those groups each bear loyalty to powerful figures within the Libyan government, though not always the same figures and not always with the same shared goals. So, on the evening of May the 12th, Genua and a handful of deputies attended a meeting at a military camp called Tripoli. The meeting was hosted by a powerful unit from Tripoli's government forces, the 444th Combat Brigade, that controls territory and exerts its own authority similar to the SSA and other paramilitaries. The meeting was purportedly an attempt to de-escalate the spiking tensions between many of Libya's armed factions. In truth, however, it appears to have been convened for a very different purpose. Once Genua arrived, he was assassinated under unclear circumstances, almost certainly by members of the 444th Brigade. Very quickly, fighting kicked off at the 444th Brigade's headquarters and then spread outward, with street battles breaking out in several locations once the news reached the rest of the city. The Tripoli government's interior minister called on residents to remain at home for their own safety as more and more militias got involved and increasingly heavier weapons started to be deployed. Now, before we can go any further, we've got to give a bit of context because without it, the state of affairs in Tripoli will be rather difficult to navigate. The first thing to understand here is that although the nation of Libya is split in two between rival governments, this particular outbreak of violence does not appear to have much, if anything, to do with the opposition government under the control of the warlord Khalifa Haftar. Instead, this is functionally an internal conflict between factions that are ultimately loyal to the internationally recognized government in Tripoli. We've also got to understand the power dynamics at play here, especially as they relate to Genua and the SSA paramilitary. Within Tripoli's complicated hierarchy, Genua was a particularly important power broker with deep roots inside Libya's detention systems and a considerable ability to raise funds for militia organizations through what we could charitably describe as shady tactics. Genua was personally implicated by the European Centre for Constitutional and Human Rights in a range of crimes against humanity, including the systemic and organised mistreatment of refugees and other migrants, the use of torture, and extrajudicial executions. shady tactics. But Ghanua and his SSA organization also filled another important role inside Tripoli as one of the most powerful militias that doesn't directly support the Tripoli government's prime minister, Abdul Hamid Adbaiba. Serving the dual functions of PM and defense minister, Adbaiba has overseen a slow-burning power struggle across the city. Some paramilitaries and military units, like the 444th Brigade that killed Ghanua, swear loyalty to him. Others support his government, but are tools for high-profile government ministers, typically powerful men with a non-zero inclination to stab Adbaiba in the back if it suits them. The SSA is among those militias that aren't directly loyal to the PM, although they've been able to maintain a fragile balance in Tripoli for years as they work toward goals in the same general direction that would benefit the PM's interests. But with the decision to assassinate the SSA's leader, it quickly became clear to all in Tripoli that this wasn't a simple attempt to settle a personal score. Instead, it was a power play, with all of Tripoli to play for. As the course of the street fighting ultimately made clear, Adbaiba and his forces were ready to take advantage of the chaos. For several nights in a row, pro-PM forces engaged their rivals in all-out urban warfare, with heavy fighting reported in several densely populated districts and in or around critical infrastructure targets like the port of Tripoli that individual militias have controlled for years. At the heart of the violence was the face-off between the 444th Brigade and the SSA, a battle that the 444th proved it was able to win. With time to lay plans for a shock offensive that the SSA didn't know was coming, the 444th was able to run through the opposition across much of the city. Casualties on either side are unknown, and current estimates in the single digits, dependent on the availability of dead bodies to catalogue, are almost certainly an undercount. After 2 days of battle, the Tripoli government announced a ceasefire. By then, the SSA wasn't dismantled entirely, but it was severely diminished, unlikely ever to recapture its former glory, and beaten into a satisfactory degree of submission. Adbaiba praised the operations online, calling the work of his forces, quote, a decisive step forward towards ending irregular groups. He also asserted, quoting again, there is no place in Libya except for state institutions and no authority except that of the law. But what came next was an executive order from the Tripoli government to order the dismantling of other paramilitaries and armed groups, but not the 444th Brigade or other factions aligned with the PM and his interests. Perhaps part of the plan, or perhaps not, that announcement awakened another armed group within Tripoli, arguably among the few that's as dangerous as the SSA was, or even more so. That group is known as the Special Deterrence Forces, but on the streets of Tripoli, it's better known as RADA. Numbering well over 1,000 fighters and holding control over critical targets in Tripoli, including the only functional international airport, RADA are, in a practical sense, a special operations police force. Their duties include dealing with terror attacks, finding smuggled explosives and weapons, addressing and performing rescue operations for kidnappings, fighting organized crime, and more. They're an ideologically radical Islamist faction, and they have real battlefield experience against Libya's other rival governments, and they're well connected within the grand network of Libyan paramilitary forces. On the night following the declaration of the ceasefire, seemingly well aware that its days were numbered, RADA chose to make its own play for power. Again, clashes erupted for 2 consecutive nights, this time with heavily armed columns of other paramilitary forces moving into the city. Some came in support of RADA, others in support of Adbaiba, and all of them contributed to some of the heaviest fighting to date. But again, it appeared in the aftermath that Adbaiba and his forces had won. By the following Saturday, a ceasefire was back in place, and this time it appeared able to hold at least through the time of writing. In public statements over television, Adbaiba personally acknowledged the destruction, but emphasized his government's commitment to, quote, a Libya free of militias and corruption. Adbaiba called for all remaining armed groups to align themselves with the Tripoli government and wrote off the recent fighting in civilian areas as a, quote, shared mistake that wasn't to be repeated. Adbaiba insisted to the Libyan public that individual militias, quote, had grown excessively to the point of controlling the entire political, financial, economic, and even social landscape. And in the days following Adbaiba's address, the people of Libya received macabre evidence of what the militias had been doing in the shadows. At a hospital in Tripoli that had, until very recently, been under the control of the SSA, at least 58 unidentified corpses were located in a morgue refrigerator in varying stages of decomposition. It was the second set of corpses found at SSA-controlled hospitals within just a few days, with the previously unreported bodies thought to be people the SSA had killed. But as Tripoli began to resume normal life and take stock of the violence, it quickly became clear that Adbaiba's troubles aren't over yet. The weekend saw multiple rallies, thousands of supporters strong, against the Tripoli government, including a march on Adbeba's office. According to Libyan media, no fewer than 6 of his ministers and deputy ministers resigned their posts, while several municipal councils in Tripoli echoed the demand that Adbeba step down. At issue for the protesters is Adbeba's rapid consolidation of his own direct control over the city, a lack of movement toward forming a new government, and the destruction of militias that, while certainly violent, still drew strong support across much of Tripoli. Adbeba was forced to publicly acknowledge their discontent, and we'll quote him here. "The protests are annoying, but I put up with them. I know some of them are real, but a lot of them are paid." In the coming weeks and months, the strength of the protest and civil movement against Adbeba may decide whether he can consolidate his gains. The leader of the Tripoli government's High Council of State has announced that the government will begin moving toward elections, a process that could finally oust Adbeba from his post. For reference, he was appointed as PM in February of 2021 and was expected to resign by December of that same year, meaning that he's 3.5 years over his mandate. He, indeed, has served about 5 times the tenure that he was supposed to. But as has been laid bare over the course of the recent fighting, Adbeba is very powerful inside Tripoli. He's believed to have embezzled billions from the Libyan regime, giving him the financial resources to make a long-term play for control, and he's already eliminated the armed factions that would pose the greatest threat to him within his own government. You can also expect prosecution for various corrupt acts if he leaves his post, meaning that he's got all the more incentive to ensure that he can cling to power. Given Libya's divided status, the armed groups at Adbeba's back, and his combination of incentives to keep power and disincentives to give it up, it's not hard to see Adbeba clinging to his post despite political attempts to remove him. In a country that spent decades under the yoke of Muammar Gaddafi, it's not difficult to imagine a worst-case scenario. And on the subject of Libya's divided status, it's important to emphasize that Tripoli's week of violence doesn't necessarily lead to a clear result. On the one hand, there's certainly an argument that Adbeba and the Tripoli government are weaker than they've ever been, rocked by internal clashes that have destroyed or dismantled a fair portion of their fighting force and organized around a leader whose lack of popular support makes him an unlikely option to reunify the nation. Under that interpretation, Libya's rival government has nothing to worry about and could even take advantage of the violence to make another power play, although an attack from Haftar currently seems unlikely. Now, on the other hand, there's an argument that in the long run, dismantling rival paramilitaries will allow Tripoli to break out of the cycle that's defined the last several years. Without being so divided between rival fighting factions, the Tripoli government could move on and address the question of reunification either by diplomacy or by force if necessary. Right now, the only thing we can do is wait and see how things in Tripoli will shake out. Whether the anti-Adbeba movement gains in strength, whether there's further violence from splinter groups or holdouts within the non-government-aligned paramilitary sphere, or whether crackdowns begin, will decide whether this violence leads to change or into the Adbeba era. Finally, we turn our attention to the border between Guyana and Venezuela, where a string of recent confrontations would suggest that the Venezuelan government is up to something fishy. The target is the region of Essequibo, quite possibly the most valuable patch of land worldwide that almost nobody has ever heard of. Now, before we get into what happened less than 2 weeks ago, we've got to talk about the much larger dispute over the Essequibo region. So, Essequibo is internationally recognized as territory under the control of Guyana, a small English-speaking nation in South America that's home to a bit less than 1 million people in total. Essequibo in particular is sparsely populated, hard to access, and mostly undeveloped, although it makes up a large portion of Guyana's total land area. But Essequibo is important to Guyana, not just because of its relative size, but because ever since 2017, Essequibo has been Guyana's golden ticket to prosperity. In that year, Guyana discovered oil in an area called the Stabroek Block offshore to Essequibo, with an estimated 11 billion barrels of oil reserves. Taking oil at its price on the day that this episode was written, that's a value equivalent to well over $700 billion US. Enough money to give every single man, woman, and child in Guyana nearly $1 million apiece. The offshore oil reserves in Guyana's control currently represent the single largest addition to the world's oil reserves in half a century. But in a way, it really shouldn't be a surprise that when Guyana made its gargantuan find, neighboring Venezuela suddenly dug up a series of old territorial claims that would just happen to grant it dominion over the new reserves. Venezuela lays claim to the largest proven oil reserves in the world, and the nation is always hungry for more, especially when it comes at the expense of a neighbor that could grow into a disproportionately influential power player at a time when Venezuela is politically ostracized from most of the world. Now, to be fair to Venezuela, Caracas has laid claim to Essequibo for a very long time, and its claim is one that the vast majority of Venezuelans have supported for decades. But it was only after the discovery of oil that Caracas became interested in pressing that claim, and over the course of the last 2 years or so, Venezuela has doubled and redoubled its efforts to that end. Toward the end of 2023, Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro announced that it would host a public referendum in Venezuela to reject the international ruling that makes Essequibo part of Guyana, creating an Essequiban state in Venezuela and grants citizenship to everybody who lives there. In Venezuela's tightly controlled political system, it was no surprise that the referendum passed. Then Venezuela created the state it had promised. Maduro threatened invasion and direct annexation and moved troops to the border in a show of force, although no direct invasion ultimately took place. Last July, Venezuela built a bridge to link the Venezuelan mainland to a military base on a disputed river island on the border. In January of this year, Venezuela announced that it would hold elections in Essequibo, and in March, the nation sent a naval gunboat to warn ExxonMobil, harvesting oil on behalf of Guyana, that ExxonMobil was intruding in a Venezuelan exclusive economic zone. It was against this troubling backdrop that Guyana made global headlines in mid-May when the nation's military, the Guyana Defense Force, announced that its soldiers had come under attack in Essequibo 3 times in the span of just 24 hours. The attacks took place along the banks of the Siuni River, a river that flows near the Venezuela-Guyana border and even demarcates the border for a span of about 100 kilometers. In that area, several Guyanese patrols reported having been attacked by armed men wearing civilian clothing. As the Guyana Defense Force surmised in its announcement, quote, "On each occasion, the Guyana Defense Force executed a measured response and no rank sustained any injuries." Now, the nation pledged to keep up its own territorial defense and explicitly implicated the attack as part of an ongoing series of, quote, "acts of aggression along the Guyana-Venezuela border." Now, on its face, this might almost seem like a non-incident. Some nobodies with guns shot toward a patrol, nobody was hurt, and that should be the end of it. Or at least, it would be, if not for the implication that the armed men involved were most likely acting on behalf of Venezuela. This is not an area with high rates of transnational organized crime. It's not a place that armed gangs of drug smugglers or human traffickers would just be wandering around. Even if they were, they certainly wouldn't be so brazen as to fight Guyanese soldiers 3 times in the span of a single day. Nor does Guyana deal with insurgent groups in the Essequibo region, at least not for now. Instead, the consensus both within Guyana and across the international community was that the armed men in question were either Venezuelan operatives or non-Venezuelans operating on Venezuela's behalf. What exactly they were intending to do in Essequibo is uncertain. They could have been engaged in all manner of shadowy operations. But the fact that a prior ambush in Essequibo this past February left 2 Guyanese soldiers in critical condition and 4 others injured at the hands of suspected Venezuelan operators would certainly give some indication of the likely possibilities. If the allegations of Venezuelan culpability are true, then that would mean that Venezuela is engaged in some murky form of asymmetrical grey zone warfare inside of Guyana. Whether they'd be trying to gather intelligence or lay traps and conduct sabotage operations or inspire a local insurgency or something else entirely is unclear. But no matter the specifics, their presence would suggest that Venezuela really is gearing up for the fight it's avoided starting thus far. To be clear, a fight between Venezuela and Guyana would be no fight at all. A total of 3,400 active personnel serve in the Guyana Defense Force, a combined branch's military with precisely 1 deteriorating naval combat vessel, 0 tanks, 0 combat aircraft, and roughly 6 artillery guns in total. By contrast, Venezuela's military includes about 110,000 active duty personnel and double that number in paramilitaries, outnumbering Guyana about 100 to 1. Add to that nearly 200 main battle tanks, a few ships that could actually hold their own in a firefight, and about 24 combat aircraft, and suffice it to say that 1 half-hearted military bitch slap from Venezuela would be enough to send Guyana's military flying out of its own fatigues, cartoon style. Luckily, of course, we don't live in a world of military slaps, or at least we didn't until the events of the last several years turned the international order on its head. Although rapid and stunning changes have come from many directions at once, the most obvious example would be Russia's ongoing invasion of Ukraine. And in this particular case, the Russian comparison goes a good deal farther than just showing that we live in a world where nations can still invade their neighbors as they see fit. In Venezuela's case, Russia is of particular importance. After all, it's Russia that is Venezuela's primary international backer on the global stage. It's Russia that sees kinship in Venezuela as a fellow authoritarian petrostate, and it's Russia that could stand to gain from inflamed tensions in Latin America. Russia would especially benefit if those tensions came by way of a brazen land grab that would show the global West yet another place that its beloved rules and norms can't survive the pressure of real life. And we only need to take a look as far as Russia to find a recent example of the very same grey zone warfare tactics that Venezuela seems to be engaged in. Wind back the clock by a little more than a decade, and you'll find the 2014 Crimea crisis, where it wasn't uniformed Russian soldiers that took over the Crimean Peninsula, but masked, unidentified operatives known colloquially as the Little Green Men. Those forces, operating on Moscow's behalf, took control of the peninsula without Russia ever formally involving itself, instead simply waiting for the operatives to give the outward appearance of a mysterious takeover and then annexing the territory that was handed to Moscow on a silver platter. For Venezuela to be contemplating something similar in Essequibo would be a massive problem for both Guyana and the wider region. Now, to be very clear, there is no direct evidence that Venezuela is engaged in such an effort, nor is there even enough known Venezuelan grey zone activity in and around Essequibo to determine a clear pattern. But in a nation where the authoritarian government structures itself on the Russian model, where Russian military hardware and battle tactics are critical, where Russia serves as a geopolitical protector, and where Russia can present a proven path to successful annexation of a neighbor territory, the place to start when interpreting Venezuela's cross-border activity should be to look for parallels with Russia. By the time this episode releases, Venezuela either will or won't have held its scheduled vote, organised within Essequibo for Essequibans, currently slated for May the 25th. Guyana's leaders have warned that any residents who participate will be charged with felony crimes, including treason, and that the act will be viewed as a coup d'etat. But by the time this episode is released, it's entirely possible that Venezuela will have thrown down the gauntlet. And in that world, in the next instalment of The Situation Room, next week, subscribe, we will almost certainly be heading back to South America. Thank you for watching.